Welcome back to Variologies. My name is Dan Calcagno. In this video, I'm going to respond to somebody named Wes Huff, who claimed in his video that the Gospel of Mark portrays Jesus as God in every chapter. Well, we're going to look at the verses he cited and see if, in fact, those same verses can actually be understood from a Unitarian perspective. Jesus is the Messiah, not God himself. God is the one who empowers Jesus, and Jesus represents God. So all Wes is doing in this video is proving that you can read Jesus as God into any text, but it's not a necessary interpretation, because each of these passages can just as easily be understood from a Unitarian perspective, where God is only one person, the Father, and Jesus is not God, but is rather God's representative to the people. So Wes starts with Mark chapter 1, where John the Baptist prepares the way for Jesus, and he quotes Isaiah 40 verse 3. Now, it's true in Isaiah 40 verse 3 that the path that is cleared is for the Lord God. However, John the Baptist is not saying that Jesus is God. Instead, he is doing what is often done in the New Testament, taking a passage from the Hebrew Scriptures in which it says that God does something, but applying it to the ministry of Jesus. It was a way for the apostles to say that what God had foretold he was going to do is now being done through the Messiah, through Jesus. Wes then moves on to Mark chapter 2, where Jesus forgives sins, which only God can do. In Mark 2:7, Jesus' detractors say, "Why does this man speak like that? He is blaspheming. Who can forgive sin but God alone?" And Wes argues that Jesus does not correct them, thereby claiming a divine prerogative. However, the fact that Jesus exercised divine prerogatives, like forgiving sins, does not prove that he is God. It can just as easily be understood to prove that God had authorized Jesus to do certain things. As God's chosen Messiah, as his representative, Jesus was given the authority to forgive sins on God's behalf. Wes then points to Mark chapter 3, where Jesus casts out demons by his own power, which only God can do. And in Mark 3:27, Jesus speaks about binding the strong man and plundering his house, implying that Jesus had authority over Satan. But again, this is just another example of God working in and through Jesus, giving him the authority to do amazing things. God empowered Jesus to cast out demons and to demonstrate his power over evil. God was doing this through the Messiah. In chapter 4 of Mark, Wes claims that Jesus calms the storm, and this is something that only God can do. In Mark 4:38-41, Jesus rebuked the wind and the sea, and the disciples marveled that even the wind and sea obeyed him. And Wes compares this to Psalm 107:28-29, where the Lord calms the storm to a whisper. But again, this is Jesus acting with God's authority. God gave Jesus the power to calm the storm, and so it demonstrated his divine authority working through Jesus. But that doesn't mean that Jesus is God, but rather that Jesus, as God's representative, is given the ability to perform miraculous acts. In chapter 5 of Mark, Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead. And again, Wes's claim is that this is something only God can do. Wes contrasts Jesus' miracle here with Elijah in the Old Testament, who had to raise the dead by calling out to the Lord, whereas Jesus simply commanded the girl to get up. And this is an implication that Jesus has the authority over death and life, something that only God has. But again, this is Jesus doing amazing things with God's authority and power. God granted Jesus this amazing authority to even raise the dead at a word. And as the Messiah, God's power and authority in him exceeded the prophets. Wes then claims that in Mark chapter 6, Jesus walks on water, which is, again, an action attributed to God alone. And he references Job chapter 9, verse 8, which says that God alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea, suggesting that Jesus walking on water implies his divinity. But I'm a broken record at this point. Jesus is doing this with God's authority and power. God empowered Jesus to perform miracles like walking on water to demonstrate the divine power working through him. We could go on and on. So to sum up, without making this response video too long, just remember that All of the passages in the book of Mark and throughout all of the Gospels and the New Testament, anytime Jesus does something that only really God had the ability to do, it means that God was working in and through Jesus, that Jesus is the Son of God, he is the Messiah, the one representing God to us, and he was showing what God was like and what God does. So these verses do not prove that Jesus is God, but rather that God was in Jesus doing amazing things.